Good morning, y'all. Today, I want to talk about the difference between political ideology and political party because of what is going on with recent events and political discourse. We're conflating these two things together, and I don't think people realize that political parties and political ideologies aren't necessarily the same thing. And so, coming from the perspective of someone who would identify as more conservative and on the middle, my observation of folks on the left is that they haven't taken the Charlie Kirk assassination seriously. So you have folks who are celebrating it, which is just abhorrent. But then you have, political commentators who aren't calling the ideology that underpins their party. They're not calling it out, and so because they're doubling down on the rhetoric that the other side, so conservatives, are the ones inciting violence, they're unable to distinguish that an ideology has hijacked the Democratic Party. So you have otherwise rational, normal people who have been captivated and captured by the ideology. I would still say they're probably pretty level headed. So I'm thinking like your Ezra Klein type people. People who you could otherwise engage in discourse with. But they themselves, I don't think really understand what has happened to their party and the importance of ideology on their party. So they just assume it's democratic politics as usual, um, and it's not like that at all. And I think the old guard who has been in charge of the Democratic Party for years is completely um, divorced from facts on the ground, facts on the internet, and how ideology has radically transformed politics as we know it. And so I think if we want to understand what is happening right now in the United States and to find a path forward, I think we need to decouple political ideology from political party. And I think we need a different language and framework for understanding politics. It can't just be Democrats versus Republicans, right versus left anymore. And I'm guilty of this, right? I've used the leftist ideology because frankly, I don't have the vocabulary. I don't know how to describe it. It's I think what we're witnessing is the emergence of a completely new ideology, and there just isn't that vocabulary, the language to quantify and capture what is actually happening. So we're all reverting back to these old ways of looking at things. And I think that's a little outdated. But to understand where we are and where we're heading, I think you have to understand what political ideologies are and how they are distinct from political parties. So I'm going to draw a lot of the information I'm going to talk about from this book. This is called Political Ideologies and Introduction, 7th edition. It's by Andrew Hayward. It's a like a thin textbook on political ideology. So it talks about like the framework of an ideology, but then it also goes into different types of ideologies. So everything from liberalism to conservatism to socialism to feminism and fundamentalism. So all sorts of different ideologies. I'm just going to highlight a few here that I think are relevant. So the most important thing to think about when we talk about political ideologies is that they are a coherent set of ideas that provides the basis for organized political action. So they are ideas that are the foundation for then taking action. So the ideology is the belief system, the things, the values, the truths you hold to be dear, and then you go out and you take action politically based on those ideas. So if your idea, if you believe in collectivism and social justice, you are going to take political action. So that could be voting along democratic lines. That could be volunteering with an NGO or a nonprofit that advances that mission. It could be donating money. It could be writing content or writing essays and content and op-eds and that kind of stuff. All sorts of different ways you can take political action. But those are just a couple ideas. And so a political ideology fundamentally is a prescription for what the world should be. It's not necessarily what the world is, it's what you think the world should be based on the set of ideas that shape your worldview. And so you can really think of a political ideology as a system of values related to a desired social order or worldview. So if you are a conservative, Christianity might be important to you, as was Charlie Kirk. So your system of values is going to be rooted in the Bible, and it's going to be rooted in the teachings of Jesus. And your desired social order is a moral, objective social order. Okay. You might not necessarily, I mean, you might aspire for everyone to become a Christian like you. I think that might be the ideal. That's not pragmatic, especially in a country like the United States. So your objective is for a world order or just a cohesion, social cohesion based around commonly agreed objective moral principles. So thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not steal. Love thy neighbor as yourself. Those kinds of things. So all political ideologies include three things. So you have to have a critique of the existing order, you have to have a vision for the future, and you have to have a path to get there. And so the theory of political change, or the path to get there, is I think where political parties come into play. So political parties are the mechanism that enables you to take action. So according to Wikipedia, the definition of a political party is an organization that coordinates candidates to compete in elections and participate in governance. It is common for members of a party to hold similar ideas about politics, and parties may promote specific ideological or policy goals. So you can be of the same ideological persuasion within the Democratic Party, but in times past, that wasn't always necessarily the case. And I think if you look at Republican politics, this is a really good example. So you have, fiscal conservatives, and you have social conservatives within the Republican Party. So both have an ideology, right? Fiscal conservatives are less concerned about the morality and the social order. They're more concerned with how we spend money and property ownership and free enterprise. Whereas social conservatives are probably going to be more aligned with Christianity, and they want a restoration of family values and an objective moral order. So those are two examples. Yeah, and I know there is like a separate libertarian party. It doesn't really have a lot of momentum in the United States, but that's an example of within the Republican Party, you have people that have different ideological motivations, but they're still under the umbrella of the Republican Party. The same, I think, used to be true for the Democratic Party. So you used to have like more union, working class, worker, labor oriented Democrats. And then you used to have like socially progressive Democrats, are the ones fighting for changes to the social order. But I think that has changed. That has changed since 2016, where it's become a very absolutist political party. So whereas there are multiple ideologies within the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party is now a single ideology. And I don't know that we have a name for this ideology, to be totally honest. Leftism, wokeism, socialism, I don't know what you want to call it, but there is a distinct worldview and a set of conditions that you have to accept to be part of today's Democratic Party. And this encompasses a whole spectrum of issues ranging from abortion to immigration to social justice reform, to trans rights. And so I think this is why a lot of people, myself included, have left the Democratic Party over recent years. There's been a fundamental disagreement with the policies. You can look at COVID, bathroom, trans bathroom and sports stuff, immigration, how illegal migrants have been treated at the expense of citizens. You can point to specific policies, but fundamentally, it's about the ideology. Like, you can't square the circle on a lot of these things, right? Like, within the Democratic Party, you have to accept feminism. So you have to accept that women are paid less than men, but at the same time, you also have to accept that gender is fluid and doesn't exist as a social construct. So there's all of these like inherent paradoxes within the ideology, but because of how absolutist and puritanical it's become an all or nothing party. But the political party itself is the mechanism for implementing the ideology. And so just to give you some context, if you're not familiar where left and right comes from, this came from the French Revolution. So prior to 1798, there wasn't left versus right. Like, this idea of left and right in politics didn't exist. It emerged out of the French Revolution. So those who sat on the left side of the General Assembly were pro-revolution. So they're more seeking progress. So that's where progressive comes from. Whereas the right was reactionary. They were the ones who wanted to seek the preservation of the status quo. And so in that regard, status quo wasn't just monarchy. It was how property was owned, how the estates were set up within the French government, but also social status. Like, I think this is hard for Americans to understand, but Europe is predicated on a social hierarchy and an order that we just don't have. We never existed here. So even when you talk about ideological development of European politics, so the emergence of socialism and communism, it's frankly really hard for Americans to understand because our political tradition here um, really has never been challenged at the ideological level. Like, we have always been a lowercase liberal society built on, Enlightenment ideals, freedom, liberty, kind of coexist, assimilate, but, you do your own thing. That has always been the American way of life. And so even when you talk about ideologies that emerged out of Europe, I think we try to think of them as like one and the same, but the American context of politics and ideological development is just so fundamentally different from Europe. And the conditions and the reasons why different political, the founders of different political ideologies, their grievances against the status quo, capitalism and that kind of stuff. Their reasons for that are fundamentally different than here in the United States. And I'm not saying that things were perfect, right? It wasn't like perfectly kumbaya. But the degree and level of exploitation here was very different than what you saw in Europe, in Great Britain, and continental Europe. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. But just for the reference here, left and right, when we talk about that, really does come down to the French Revolution. And left was those who wanted revolution, wanted bloodshed. The right wanted preservation of the status quo. And so I pulled this image from this textbook here, the Political Ideologies book, and it talks about ideologies as a linear spectrum. So you could think of it with communism on the left, fascism on the right, and in the middle you have socialism, liberalism, and conservatism. And those are three different flavors, if you will, of ideologies that progress, to the left and to the right. What's important about socialism, liberalism, and conservatism is they're all pretty much the same thing. At the foundation, they're all about different ways of managing capitalism and the order of the time. So conservatism is more of a preservation of hierarchy and authority within the social strata. Socialism is more about equality, cooperation, collectivism. Liberalism is more free enterprise, let me do my own thing. But all of them more or less accept capitalism to a degree. Once you start getting more into the socialist, communist, Marxist thinking, it's more of a rejection of capitalism. But in the beginning, I'm talking early, like 19th century, socialism really was founded out of a frustration with capitalism and views of exploitation. So I don't know that early capitalist founder or theorists were necessarily advocating for the elimination of ownership. It was just they wanted a better way of doing things where more workers, more people benefited. And it wasn't as exploitative. That obviously changed when Marx came onto the scene in the mid 19th century. But that kind of gives you an idea of where things are. So here in the United States, conservative ideology kind of aligns with the Republican Party. I would say it's both liberalism and conservatism. And I suspect the vast majority of Republicans are lowercase l liberals. Like they're classical liberals. They share again those Enlightenment ideals, free speech and private property ownership and that kind of stuff. There are some, I'm sure, that are more conservative in the ideological sense, but I suspect from a governance perspective, the vast majority are lowercase l liberals. And if they are, Christians, that is shaping their social and moral worldview. But the vast majority aren't seeking like a theocratic state in the United States. And I think that's an important distinction because a lot of folks who identify with leftist ideologies just assume anyone who is a Christian or anyone who is more right than they are automatically, a fascist. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But there's just then this conflation. And I think I think it's not as cut and dry as that. You know, lowercase l liberals is kind of the middle, and by making that seem more of an extreme view, it's kind of degraded the meaning of discourse and why we're in this place where we're at now. So on the other hand, you know, the Democratic Party is more aligned with leftist ideology, so you can think socialist or communist. And I do want to caveat here, because I think socialism does get a bad rap in the United States, and I think there's good reason for that. But socialism can also mean social democracy. So, you know, you could use a Scandinavian country as an example. And socialism can happen on a small scale too. Really, it's all about community and, you know, collective good. So it's not fundamentally a bad thing. Like, these things aren't fundamentally good or bad. We are the ones who have put moral judgments on this. Well, you know, I think communism and fascism, you can put your judgments there based on what history has revealed about those. But socialism, liberalism, and conservatism, it's just different ways of managing society. You know, some more individualistic and hierarchical than others. But it's just it's neither good nor bad. I think there's pros and cons to each. And I think because we just see everything now in this like absolutist lens, it's hard to parse out the good from the bad. So another way of looking at this is as a horseshoe, where communism and fascism are actually quite closer than people realize. They're just kind of opposite ends of the same coin. And I think the reason for that is because both communism and fascism share a bend towards totalitarianism. And so that's because both communism and fascism replace capitalism. So they are an alternative to capitalism, truly an alternative to capitalism. You can have you know, like I said, social democracies and still have private ownership. But once you get into communism, you know, that's when you're replacing private ownership with state control over production and distribution of, you know, goods and services within the economy. So just to kind of do a bit of a tangent here. So I think it's important to talk about totalitarianism because fascism is being used so flippantly, and fascism in and of itself is an ideology, not a system of government. Totalitarianism is the system of government that fascists use along with communists. And that's why you see this horseshoe here, because again, they're two sides of the same coin. But totalitarianism is a centralized and dictatorial system of government, and it requires complete subservience to the state. So Nazi Germany and communist Russia were both totalitarian systems of government, and they represent different political ideologies. So this is another book I would highly recommend reading, The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. She's a political scientist that wrote about Nazi Germany as well as communist Russia. And she has a lot of interesting things to say. And I think this is important to understand because here in the United States, we're taught in our history classes, we're taught about fascism and we're taught about totalitarianism with regard to Nazism. And because Stalin was opposed to Hitler and the United States allied with Stalin during the war, it's just assumed and taken for granted that Stalin was a good guy, when in reality, communism and fascism are just two different ideological persuasions that seek the same outcome, which is totalitarian rule. And so this language gets really obfuscated. And people just assume if you are anti-fascist, you are therefore good. And both fascists and communists seek the same thing, and that is centralized and dictatorial control with subservience to the state. Their means of doing so and the objectives of their respective ideologies are different. But they both want the same thing. And I think that's important for understanding where we're at today. So let me dive into a few of the big, I think, ideologies that play a role in U.S. politics today. So the first one is classical liberalism. It was an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution, promoted individualism, freedom, reason, and justice. It was a focus on the middle class. So what you have to understand is because of capitalism, the middle class became not just a thing, but a thing with social capital and political power. So before capitalism, feudal Europe was really predicated on the power of the church, the power of the monarchy, and then the feudal lords that, were delegated authority, but still deferred to the authority of the monarch, right? But you really didn't have a middle class. There was just, you either were in power or you weren't. You were part of the nobility or you weren't. So the capitalism, first mercantilism, but then capitalism made it possible for average peasants to generate surplus value, so a profit off of a trade, a craft, or being a mercantilist and selling products. You could earn a profit for yourself and then build something from it. So you could be a cobbler, for example, in a little town, and then because of the Industrial Revolution and the ability to buy new, factories, you could take your surplus profit from being a cobbler and you could go open a factory in London. And that was profound because that didn't exist before. Nowhere in history has that ever existed. Everyone had a fixed place in society. So this is what makes classical liberalism so important and so unique, is it gives average people like you and I a shot at upward social mobility that can translate into real economic and political power that never previously existed before. Obviously, classical liberalism is built on the free market. It has the idea of meritocracy, so you're rewarded for your hard work and talent. They believe that the state has a limited role, and I think in the United States we saw this before the Great Depression. The federal government had a very limited role in what it did. Really, classical liberalists believe that the state should just be there to maintain peace and stability because that is the foundation of enterprise. So if you don't have stability and peace in an area, your factories can't run, your workers can't get to work, people can't go buy things. So in order for the economy to run, you need to have peace and stability. Some well-known folks who talked about this were John Stuart Mill, John Locke, Adam Smith, and of course democracy, or what we have here in the United States. That is a manifestation of classical liberalism, and I'd say this is the only ideology that has really been not the only, obviously. I mean, some other stuff has come in recent years, but for the most part, like, this has been the primary ideology that has governed how the United States is run. And really, it's up until just the past few decades where we've started to have conversations that deviate from classical liberalism. So conservatism, which I think gets confused with classical liberalism, came out of the French Revolution. So you have to keep in mind that classical liberalism preceded conservatism. And conservatives took issue with liberalism because obviously it gave a new class of people power. And so it wasn't built on the previous power structure. So conservatives prioritize tradition, and in this case, religion. And that makes sense because the church always had supremacy and political power in Europe. They also believe in a hierarchy or a natural inequality. So everyone has a place and position in society. And it's not necessarily good or bad per se. Like, it's not like there's a bunch of evil nobles who are sitting at the top and they're like, "Ooh, how can I abuse the peasantry today?" I mean, sure, there's people like that. But there's also your Downton Abbey type people who, your nobles recognized they were employers for a lot of people. They had a responsibility and a duty. So it wasn't just like ambivalence towards poor people. Like, they believed they owed something as well to the people that they employed and to the social order that they, were at the top of. So, I think they get a negative, elitists get a negative reputation. I'm talking about 19th century here, 19th and early 20th century. I think they get a bad rap. And that's not necessarily how they viewed themselves, to put it that way. So the goal of conservatism is to conserve what is and is to uphold social structures. Conservatives are suspicious of change. So change in this context would be liberalism. But there's some things that they agree on. So they agree on property ownership and the importance of it, the importance of free markets, the importance of a limited state, and in much the same way as classical liberals. So I would say in the role of the state and the role of the economy, there's a lot of overlap between classical liberals and conservatives. But when it comes to, social structures and the means of participating in politics, I think that's where conservatives defer back to what has always and previously existed. So you see this to an extent in democracy, but really it's a proponent. They propose are proponents of monarchy. And some examples of this are Edmund Burke. Ronald Reagan here in the United States is usually attributed with conservatism, and then Ayn Rand would be another example of a writer who was a proponent of conservatism. So now we get into socialism. So socialism emerged in the 19th century as a reaction to conditions of workers in Europe and as a result of industrialization and capitalism. So this is a reaction to when industrialization and capitalism is taken to its logical end state without any sort of, guardrails in place. What happens, and it was a lot of exploitation of workers, exploitation of the environment. Some not so good things came out of it, right? Socialism wasn't an attempt to combat that, to recognize that, okay, this isn't getting us where we wanted. This isn't the progress we were looking for. Maybe we need to go in a different direction. So the point of socialism is that it promotes cooperation instead of competition, and that's distinct from capitalism because capitalism is all about competition. So the ideal vision for socialists is some sort of utopia. Like they just want to pursue this paradise utopic vision of the future where everyone's just happy and kumbaya. Social equality is designed to induce stability through community and cooperation. So again, stability is important, whereas conservatives and classical liberals will defer to the state to ensure that. Socialists will look to one another, and they'll look to community and cooperation, and they'll do that through social equality. They believe that you can overcome economic and social problems through community, so collectivism. And so everything is viewed through the lens of social class. And I think that is important because it's a distinction that hadn't been seen. So up until this point. So whereas classical liberals gave the middle class a chance to compete for power, it still didn't really help peasants that much. So socialism was an attempt to really help the peasantry, the workers, people find meaning in the new political milieu that was taking shape in Europe during this time. They believe property ownership is unjust because it induces greed. And they believe that that's like the natural instinct of humans is to be greedy, and that's why it should be collectively owned. Common examples of socialist thinkers are Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, Karl Marx, and communism is the political system of government where this is usually manifested. And then, of course, the last one I want to talk about is fascism. So fascist political parties formed in Italy and Germany in 1919. So this was an outgrowth of World War I. Individual identity was absorbed as a larger part of a bigger community and a social group. So you weren't you were Italian or you were German, and you weren't just German, you were Aryan German, right? So there was a lot of it was very much identity politics, but taken to the extreme. You could say this was a political religion more than just an ideology, and that's because you had to have absolutist acceptance of its worldview, which is notable considering where we are at this point in today's political culture. Some of the biggest values within this ideology are loyalty, duty, obedience, and self-sacrifice. The idea behind it is that you would defer your obedience to a supreme leader. So there's a charismatic organizing figure. So in Italy it was Mussolini, and in Germany it was Hitler. And so fascism manifested differently in Italy and Germany. And Italy is all about the state, so statism. In Germany, it was about racial theory. And so I do think that is important because, it's kind of an ideology within ideology. So that's why this stuff can get really, really confusing. It was an overall rejection of Enlightenment values. So they rejected rationalism, progress, freedom, and equality. They didn't see. So again, you have to think of this in the post-World War I context. You had just gone. So if you think post-French Revolution, 1798. Okay, so you've seen, 120-ish years, 130-ish years of development in Europe. And it was pretty tumultuous, right? So you had the French Revolution, you had the revolutions in 1848, you had the creation of new states, the dissolution of old states. Like during this period of time, Germany became to exist. Like the Prussian Empire collapsed. Germany, consolidated and became a unified country. Nationalism took off during this time. That's another example of an ideology, but where, you defer to your nation. That really hadn't existed before. You weren't necessarily a Frenchman, in the pre-Napoleonic period. You were part of your local town. But really, the monarch was the central figure of how Europe was organized. It wasn't this idea of states. So that even in itself was rather new. So it was a rejection of everything that came out of the Enlightenment. It was anti-intellectual. They definitely focused more on your emotions, and you can see that in Nazi propaganda. There's definitely an appeal to, emotion more than there is to rationalism and like logic. There was this belief of strength through unity, strength through moral and cultural unity. So, you had to subvert your personal whims to the state, not just for your good, not just for the collective good of the nation, but so that the nation could be strong, right? And again, you do see that in Nazi propaganda as well. There's no distinction between public and private life, so everything is open, and the governmental manifestation of that was totalitarianism. So fascism, this belief where intellectualism is bad, enlightenment values are bad, strength through unity, obedience to supreme leader, individual identity as part of a bigger collective group. That is the ideology. That is the worldview. And then that manifests in a totalitarian state, which, as I talked about here, is centralized and dictatorial control that requires subservience to the state. So fascism can lead to totalitarianism, but they're not necessarily one and the same, because communism can also lead to totalitarianism as well. Okay, so I think what we're seeing now is the emergence of a completely new ideology. So in much the same way, you look at fascism here, right? Fascism didn't exist before 1919. There wasn't a word for fascism. There wasn't necessarily like you couldn't just pick up the New York Times and go have like coffee with someone and start talking about, fascist political ideology, because it was still coming into being and it hadn't quite fully manifested in the way that, those of us alive today can look back and see the horrors of it. Like, it hadn't fully manifested yet. It was still fresh and new, and it was coming off the coattails of the World War I, right? So people were obviously like, that was a horrific event in Europe. And so you have to understand the context in which fascism came into being to understand it. And so I think we're at the same point right now with Gen Z and political culture in the United States. I think we've moved past the left and the right paradigm. I don't think that's relevant anymore. And I think because we don't see the distinction between ideology and political party and the difference between the two, I think it's really hard for us to even talk about what's happening. And so that's why everything is, the leftists are doing this and the right is doing this. And because left equals Democrat, the Democrats are doing this and the right is, the Republicans are doing this. And it's become this blame game. And I think the people who need to, the leaders, the leaders of the political parties, don't have the capacity, specifically, I think on the left, the Democrats, I don't think they have the capacity to see the distinction, because they are so caught up and captured by the ideology that they can't extricate themselves. Like, they can't stigmatize or isolate. They can't isolate the ideology and kind of find a way to like make it lose oxygen, right? If it were a fire, like they need to turn off the oxygen. They need to suffocate it. They need to suffocate the ideology, because I think it's as we'll talk about in a minute, I think it's not good ideology that is emerging. But I think these ideologies that are coming to bear are largely being driven by Gen Z and digital culture. And so I think that's important to consider, because all of us alive, millennials and older alive today, we have memory of a political history that's distinct from what we're living in now. We, some of us voted before, 2016. I think my first election I voted in was 2012. I was too young in 2008. But, we have experienced voting in, a civil political debate. Like, I distinctly remember when Obama and John McCain were on the campaign trail, and I think John McCain was at a town hall and someone asked him, to call Obama a racist or something, or say something about Obama. And John McCain was like, no, I will not do that. And so there was this moral character and ethos that even if you disagreed with John McCain politically, you still respected him. And I think the death of Charlie Kirk reveals how far we've gone. Because I would say Charlie Kirk was probably a, John McCain type figure in terms of morality, reverence, ability to rally, the Republican Party, just someone people liked and could get around and, respected. He wasn't necessarily as divisive as I think folks are making him out to be. And so the fact that we've gone from that exchange with John McCain and Barack Obama to where we're at now kind of shows you where we're at. So what's important to keep in mind with Gen Z, the oldest was born in 1997. So that means their first opportunity to participate in politics would have been the 2016 election. So they would have been 18 years old for the 2016 election, 18, 19 years old. So I would have been in college, or at the end of high school, and so I do think that's important because then, a ton of stuff happened. So they started entering the workforce in 2019, right? So before COVID kind of screwed everything up, and so since then we've seen one of the most contentious, political elections of our time. The election of Donald Trump in 2016. You saw a massive pandemic. Currently, right now, you're seeing AI-related job displacement, cost of living crisis. You're seeing all of this, and this entire generation, unlike generations past, is digitally native. So the way that they are interacting with politics and they're having these conversations is completely different than the rest of us. You might remember sitting in a college lecture or debating someone or having an in-person conversation discussing these things, or not even discussing them at all, to be totally honest. Like, I remember, I had worked when I was, very much a liberal. I had work trips with conservatives, and we never really talked about politics. Or if we did, it was never vitriolic, right? It was always, I never felt like they were coming for, like, it was an existential threat to my existence, right? And that has completely changed. I mean, we live in a world now where words are considered violence. And so I think this is indicative of a completely new ideology that is taking shape, because the people at the vanguard of this ideology, Gen Z, they are living in a completely different world where political discourse has an entirely new meaning for them, and where their expectations of reality are like just none of it's come to fruition. They're just struggling in all facets of life, that they have adopted a completely nihilistic view of the world. So I would call their ideology, or at least one of their ideologies, nihilistic fatalism. So a lot of Gen Zers believe there's nothing they can do and it doesn't matter anyways. So nihilism is a belief in nothing. It's a rejection of all moral and political principles. And fatalism is a belief that all events are predetermined and therefore inevitable. So, we're on the United States is on a collision course. Things are about to fall off a cliff. There's nothing you can really do about it. There's nothing you can change. And oh, by the way, like, moral and political principles don't matter because everything is worthless, right? It's useless. So the problem with all of this and understanding this, and I think if you're connected with Gen Z, I think you can understand this and how negative their outlook is. And I don't know that older generations understand how this is shaping their politics, because the worldview that they have is underpinned by an ideology, and that ideology is nihilistic and fatalist in nature, and that is transcending into politics. So because they have nothing to lose, I think they're willing to do things that the rest of us would find unconscionable. That's assassinations, the bombing. If you remember, oh gosh, several months ago, there was a guy who tried to bomb a fertility clinic in California. He had a lot of fatalistic, nihilistic, anti-birth rhetoric. He had a manifesto that talked about that. Some of the school shooters we've seen have had some of this recently, and then of course, some of the stuff that's coming out with the shooter and the Charlie Kirk assassination. So I think the problem for all of us is not only does the paradigm no longer work, so the left and the right, but we're not using a fully defined language anymore. Like, a lot of this is being communicated online on Discord servers and Reddits and subreddits, 4chan, 8chan. It's using memes that normal people, I would say, don't understand or don't know. So if you're not native to the internet, like, you're not used to communicating like this. And so I think meme culture has taken on a whole new meaning. um, and it's playing a role in politics. And so a subculture has emerged online that we are completely oblivious to. So while everyone is having all these conversations about the left are doing this and the right are doing this, we're totally missing what's actually happening. And Gen Zers are growing up and they're becoming more angry at the system. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of young people as the ones who are taking action violently because they feel like they have nothing to live for and nothing to lose. So I'm going to play this clip by Cy Cantrell. She writes on Substack. I think this is a really good overview of how to look at this. She only talks about far right ideologies, but I think it's it's a good overview of the ideologies that have captured Gen Z. And then after this, I'll kind of break it down a little bit for you as well.
I wanted to jump on and add some quick gloss on recent events that might help folks who aren't plugged into the far corners of the internet make better sense of the motivations and actions of two major right wing groups that are involved in the recent events. If you're looking at a swirl of cryptic memes and trying to reverse engineer a motive, you're going to misread this story. What looks like politics is often subculture. What looks like a manifesto is sometimes a dare wrapped in a joke, wrapped in a void. And two families on the right keep getting mashed together in coverage. There's the mainline far right Christian nationalism, and then the Groyper scene, especially its black-pilled accelerationists. They overlap in rhetoric and enemies, but they don't want the same future and they don't use the internet in the same way. Groypers refers to a youth driven online far right scene that's associated with the America First brand, which is led by Nick Fuentes. Blackpill comes from incel forums and signals fatalism. So, no improvement in humanity is possible, and thereby despair is rational. Acceleration in extremist context means stoking crises to hasten societal collapse. You can think of this as builders versus burners. And so for Christian nationalism in its hard right form, it's still builder energy. It insists that the nation is or should be explicitly Christian, prizes hierarchy, order, and a return to rightful social roles. But the strategy is institutional. They want to win elections, they want to pass laws, they want to staff the courts and capture the school boards and rechristen the public square. And you hear vocabulary about restoration and revival and sovereignty and virtue. And this imagined endpoint is a moral order enforced by the state. And even when their rhetoric gets apocalyptic, the
I do want to comment here. I'm not going to go too deep into the far right Christian nationalism. I think she's conflating Christian nationalism with conservatism here. Like there's a distinction between, you know, an objective moral value system predicated on Judeo-Christian values, so like, you know, the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill, you know, that kind of stuff. I think there's a distinction between that and a theocratic state akin to Iran. And there are conservative Republicans who do espouse more of a theocratic state. I'm not saying they don't exist. I think they're a minority. And so she, you know, spliced in pictures of Charlie Kirk there. And I think that is disingenuous. I think he is more of a conservative, classical liberal conservative who has a Christian worldview. And I don't think that Christian worldview equals far right Christian nationalists. And that's important because if we want to understand these ideologies and what is driving people to take political action, remember, an ideology is a worldview, a value system that then leads to political action. If we want people to not undertake acts of political violence in order to achieve their means, we have to understand what their worldview is. And if we use coded language that obfuscates what people actually believe, then you're not going to understand why people are undertaking acts of political violence in the first place.
plan is still state power. The Groyper world orbits a completely different sun. It's youth heavy, it's a coalition that includes a lot of streamers and online personalities, and it borrows from incel forums, gamer chat, crypto cynicism, edgelord comedy, and a lot of terminally online irony. Here's the core distinction: the black pilled wing does not believe in reform, not of institutions, not of culture, and not of people. The black pill is the conviction that decline is irreversible. If nothing can be redeemed, then the only creative act is negation. And that's where accelerationism comes in. In this context, acceleration means pressing on every social fault line, race, gender, religion, class, until something breaks. It is not policy, it's physics. The expectation is collapse, followed by nothing. Unlike some white supremacist or apocalyptic Christian variants that at least fantasize about what comes after, mainstream black pill content rarely sketches a constructive post collapse order. It's entropy worship. Speed the unraveling and enjoy the spectacle. A quick detour so that we don't mix wires here. Black pilled accelerationism is not the same thing as tech bro AI accelerationism. The latter is a futurist, albeit doomy faith about speeding technological progress even at humanity's expense. Black pill is a social political fatalism that invites breakdown. Different crowds, different goals. It's also distinct from the more formal Christian nationalist project. The language sometimes rhymes, both talk about decay, but Christian nationalists think institutions can be repurposed. Black-pilled groypers think the institutions are rot. So why the memes that look like riddles? Because the memification is the ideology. The style is the substance, or as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. The meme factory does 3 jobs at once. Number 1, it allows for recruitment at scale. So high contrast, darkly funny, and deliberately absurd images travel farther than policy papers. A kid who would never sit through a speech will swallow 100 images that say more, faster, and sneakier. Number 2, plausible deniability. Irony is a Kevlar vest. If you take it literally, they were just joking. If you miss the reference, you reveal you're out of the club. The ambiguity is the shibboleth. And desensitization, number 3. Shock is used like a gym routine. The first time you see it, you flinch. The 10th time, you smirk. By the 100th time, a position that once looked unthinkable has been normalized inside the in-group. That's why the aesthetics feel like a mashup of cartoon frogs and Wojaks and glitch art and millenarian doom and consumer culture parody. The mix says nothing matters, everything's a joke, nihilism is the punchline. So who gravitates to black pill spaces? It's often younger men who feel exiled from status games that they think they can't win, like dating, elite colleges, prestige jobs, coherent communities. It's cheap status. Attention is the currency, and it bonds people who may never meet offline. That helps explain the why behind cryptic inscriptions or symbol laden posts around real world incidents. From the outside, we assume conventional motives. Ideology leads to a plan, leads to an act. Inside black pill worlds, the act is also a content drop. It's performance for an audience that reads the references, a proof of membership to people you only know by handles. Decoding the references isn't about uncovering a coherent program. It's about recognizing an identity and a dare. Don't confuse the absence of a blueprint with harmlessness, however. A politics of negation can still inspire catastrophic acts because the metric isn't does it build, but does it break? This is why For the Lulz can be both a smirk and a sincerely held view that only destruction has meaning. However, not every meme holds the same ideology, so the same image can be repurposed by different factions. What matters is the cluster: fatalism, edgelord irony, collapse talk, and status seeking through shock. When analysts try to read an incident through the old left-right scripts, they're going to miss the performance layer. If the actor is steeped in black pill culture, the motive vector points as much toward in-group status and mimetic spectacle as it does toward any policy aim. That doesn't excuse anything. It just changes the explanatory frame. You're not parsing a legislative program. You're reading an attempt to turn reality into a toxic in-joke. Last piece, why the black pill is sticky. It packages 3 things people crave when they feel powerless: certainty, community, and a role. Certainty says the game is rigged and doomed. Community says we are the ones who get the joke. And a role says speed the ending. It is a toxic story. It's also tidy, and it's available 24/7 on your phone. The antidote is not to romanticize institutions that have failed people. It's to refuse the seduction of entropy as identity. Call the black pill what it is: a permission structure for cruelty wearing the mask of sophistication, then do the unglamorous work of making meaning and belonging where spectacle can't compete. That is the difference in one line. Christian nationalism is a plan to rule. Black-pilled accelerationism is a plan to ruin. If you keep that polarity in mind, the memes stop looking like mysterious runes and start reading like what they are: billboards for a politics of nothing. I have a corollary essay up in the orange place on kitsch and its role in mainline right wing Christian nationalism if you're so inclined, but otherwise, I will see you soon.
Okay, so I want to play that not for the Christian nationalist stuff. I think she's missing a lot there, but I think her observations on black pill meme culture, I think is relevant. And I'm speaking from someone who like doesn't really understand it either. Like I'm trying to understand what's happening. I think of the Annunciation school shooter and then obviously Charlie Kirk's murder. Both those had symbols, inscriptions, things that were written that make no sense whatsoever. Um, and so I think this helps give some insight that those acts of political violence may not have necessarily been in pursuit of leftist ideology or how we currently see it as democratic leftist politics. And it may have been more a part of this new nihilistic, fatalistic ideology that's emerging, where you score clout and status by doing things like that, by committing heinous acts of murder in the real world. And then obviously there's, uh, you know, receipts of what you've done because everyone's talking about it. Your manifestos go up and all that kind of stuff. So you have permanent infamy, but within that infamy is permanent existence. Think of it like this: like everyone knows John Wilkes Booth, everyone knows Lee Harvey Oswald, right? We all know those names. Everyone's gonna remember Tyler Robinson's name, for better or for worse. So I think that's important. So I kind of jotted down some notes here because I think I had to watch what she said a couple times. Again, I think the language and the way that it's being explained isn't necessarily reaching the mainstream. I think this is really something that is endogenous to digitally native people, and even if like you're a millennial like myself and you've used the internet, you're not necessarily digitally native in the sense that you participate in culture as it exists online. I may communicate online, I may share my thoughts online, but I don't identify as participating in digital culture in the same way that a lot of these people do. And I think that's the important distinction. So, Blackpill accelerationism, according to her definitions, is an expectation of collapse followed by nothing, so inherently nihilistic. It does not believe that reform is possible, nothing can be redeemed, and decline is irreversible. So it's kind of like pointless. What's the point? That's why only destruction has meaning. So they're gonna do things that induce destruction because that's where the meaning is. Like doing good or doing things that build on society have no meaning because they expect society to collapse. So why build on something that's, sand? Why build a house on sand when the sand is going to carry the house away? So black pill means no improvement in humanity is possible. Despair is rational. Acceleration is do what you can to speed up the process of societal collapse. They worship entropy. They believe institutions are rotting. They use memes and appeals to young men locked out of status games. And I think this is important because women aren't really facing this right now. I think it's definitely more young men. But you see this throughout history where anytime you have a group of middle-aged men who are not married, do not have children, it's a recipe for a disaster. And so I think we have a crisis here with that in the United States. And so men who have nothing to work for, nothing to aspire to, I think they're looking online. And I think most of us have been focused on the manosphere. And that's what everyone's talking about. They're talking about it from a social perspective. But I think now we need to start looking at it from a political perspective because the same young men that feminists argue are being radicalized in the manosphere are probably being politically radicalized into this culture as well. And so ideology here is identity and belonging to a decentralized group. So it's not necessarily The worldview is nihilistic. The worldview is nothing matters. There's no point. Only destruction has meaning. Like that's the worldview, and your adherence to that ideology, your affiliation with that ideology is through identity and belonging to a decentralized group. And I think that's why on the left, we're seeing a rise in identity politics that really has an existential nature to it, because of this, because it's not just your identity, say, as a trans person, that's being undermined. It's your identity as part of the ideology that represents all of this. And so I think, she only talks about the far right aspect of this, which in and of itself, I think far right is coded language for fascism, because that is what the far right is. I don't think this is far right. I think this is, like I said, nihilistic fatalism. So I was trying to come up with an equivalent on the left, and I was honestly struggling to do so. But if you want to call it transgender anti-fascism, that combines transgenderism and Antifa, maybe that's a good way to look at it. But folks on the left, they're very anti-capitalist, very anti-state, anti-fascist. They want to destroy. They want to combat capitalism and the state. So in order to do so, they have to destroy. So this again aligns with this, Blackpill accelerationism, where only destruction has meaning. So only combating capitalism and state has meaning to some of these people. So it becomes a zero-sum game, where it is very existential in nature. Social political systems are based on absolute acceptance of self-declared identities, and they're inherently intersectional in nature, which means you have to accept everything on the ballot, not just, you can't just choose what you want of one identity and another. And that was my problem. That was, I for a while believed in the feminist ideology, but there were certain other elements of the leftist ticket I couldn't agree with, so I ended up having to obviously leave, because it became too irrational. In this worldview and the system, your subjective feelings override reality. So in both cases, reality is an aberration and it doesn't really exist. Like the real world isn't the world outside; it's the world online. It's the world in your inner world. It's very subjective. It's what you make of it. It's what spaces you're in. That's what reality is. And so, I mean, that's difficult from a political perspective, right? Because how do you build a coherent rule of law and run a government on a subjective reality that can change shape at any moment, any given point in time? You can't have an objective moral worldview. You can't have any sort of objectivity. You can't govern if your constituents are constantly changing and if the rules of the game are constantly changing. And I think this is why people on the right, so people, traditional conservatives, are so offended by what's happening, and they're just so repulsed by the folks who adhere to this ideology. It's not necessarily because they don't like trans people. Like that's not it at all. It's not like, they don't like trans people. It's, you can't build a foundation on any of this. It's all anarchy. There's no structure. And then you start bringing, if you get into the policy stuff, you start bringing it into the schools, then everyone has to, adhere to it. And then you have, 10-year-olds, taking injections to do hormone replacement. And I think that's where it's become a step too far, for a lot of folks. And so I think that's become the problem on a policy level. But I think on a principle, I don't think people really care that much what you do in the privacy of your own home. Like the liberal worldview, the classical lowercase l liberal worldview is, freedom. So if you want to wear a dress, if you're a dude and you want to wear a dress and heels and, change your name to Luna, like you do you. No one's stopping you. But I think it's when it starts to, when public and private now become one, when it's an absolutist ideological agenda where it's all or nothing. And then when you have a nihilistic worldview of, everything is doomed, there's no point, societal collapse is inevitable. I think that's when people start having problems with this kind of stuff. I think that's what we're seeing now. So we've also seen with this ideology that their objective is to overcome systems of oppression. So they see the state and capitalism as systems of oppression. And this includes social constructs. So anything that, you and I take for granted as defined reality is up on the table. to be destroyed. These people as well see speech as violence. So if you disagree with them on something, it can be considered hate speech and justified to be met with acts of violence in return. So this is important. This is important because the people who are part of this new Gen Z ideology, whatever you want to call it, they see violence and speech as the same thing. Whereas I think rational people see violence uses a weapon, right? And speech uses words. And you can hurt people with words, right? But you're not going to kill people with words necessarily. You know, you kill people with a weapon. And that's obviously what we saw with Charlie Kirk. And it, you know, poetically manifested that, and maybe that was the intention, right? Like the symbol of free speech, of discourse, of conversation, the symbol of that in American political culture was just gunned down. I don't think that was an accident. I think that was probably a deliberate choice, to gain whatever clout or credibility in this ideological ecosystem. These people have an aggressive opposition to far right movements. There's a lot of resentment. They seek attention, and they believe life is beyond redemption. So maybe this is, if you think of fascism, the horseshoe up here, right, with communism and fascism, maybe the same thing is true of this Antifa, transgenderism and Blackpill groiperism. I don't even know what you call it, but they're kind of two sides of the same fatalistic, nihilistic coin. I think they might think different things, have different political and policy goals, but they both believe in the the state as it exists is bad. Only destruction has meaning. Life is beyond redemption. Institutions can't be fixed. There's just this nihilistic fatalism to it. And here's a great example. So this is the a page I got from the FBI website of the Nashville Shooters Notebook that was committed by a trans individual. And this person, blames them for being born. Why does my brain not work? Because I was born. Nothing on earth can save me. Never ending pain. Religion won't save. And I think that's where we're at. And that's what makes this so important to pay attention to, because it's not just left and right. I think not acknowledging this is stoking and fanning the flames. And I think that's deliberate. Like if this individual's right, if her analysis is right, and the goal is to accelerate demise, I think the internet culture is doing a real bang up job of that, because we can't see past left and right. We're just still focused on those old paradigms. But I think what's important is, only destruction has meaning. Expectation of collapse and followed by nothing. There's this nihilistic fatalism that we're facing now, and there isn't necessarily a logic or reason to it. And because it's beyond redemption, and young people feel like they have nothing to live for, they have no prospects of dating, they have no prospects of getting married and starting a family, and they have no prospects of getting a job anymore. What do they have to live for? And I think there's a void, because she mentioned this, like a joke wrapped up in a dare wrapped up in a void. I think there's a void that everyone feels, and some people turn to religion for that, and some people don't. I think the ones who aren't turning to religion are the ones who are getting swept up by transgenderism, where they think if they physically change themselves and they alter their bodies, they'll find meaning and purpose. And if you can only find meaning and purpose through destruction, that means it's only through the destruction of themselves that they can actually come to resolution and come to the peace, the inner peace that they're looking for. And then if you combine that with an online culture that rewards, that socially rewards acts of violence, I think that is what incentivizes people to take acts of violence here. So I think we're past a traditional left-right paradigm. I don't know if old ways of looking at political violence and terrorism really align here, because I think this is so nihilistic and existential, and it messes with reality and kind of what's going on in your head, that it's beyond politics at this point. It's beyond philosophy. I think this is really a fundamental issue. So, you know, the question is, where do we go from here? What do you do with this information? And I think for one, we have to, those of us who are outside of internet culture, have to understand what this is. So it seems like young people are the ones who are adopting it the most, especially young men, those who feel like they have nothing to live for, and those who are in, I'd say trans identifying groups, because you definitely see that, right? You don't see feminists going this direction. You don't see African Americans going this direction. You don't see illegal migrants. It seems to be only trans people, like even the LGBT community, like before this. It wasn't until recently that this nihilistic fatalism became a really important part of the conversation. And so now that it is, I think you have to isolate it. Um, and that's a problem because of the absolute nature of the ideology. It's kind of blended into the other. So today you can't be a feminist without also accepting transism. You can't be, for social justice reform and, an anti-racist without also, accepting trans ideology. So you have to accept all of it, the entire package of it. And I think that's the problem. Um, so I think political leaders need to, especially Democrats, need to stop taking this personally and stop fueling the flames. Like I think we have to, now would be a good time for folks to come to the table and be like, "Hey, I was wrong. This isn't calling you far right. That's not appropriate. You're not really that far right. That's not appropriate." I think people need to publicly state they were wrong, walk back their comments, not just because they're being called out. I think they need to volunteer it, right? You can't just, what happened with Stephen King, right, in his comments regarding Charlie Kirk. You can't just call him out and then he apologize and then act like everything's okay, right? You need political leaders, someone like Kamala Harris, for example, to come out, someone like Tim Walz to come out and say voluntarily and say, the language I've been using to describe folks that I politically disagree with is charged and loaded and I'm not going to use it anymore, and I'd encourage you not to either. Like I was wrong. Like someone like her, someone like him, they need to come out and say that. The problem is AOC, that'd be another great example. The problem is the Democratic Party doesn't really have leadership anymore. And so that's what's scary about this is there's no one calling the shots. There's no one here calling the shots. It's just a bunch of random people on Discord servers talking to each other. And so if Democrats want to course correct, I think they need to be aware of this subculture that has emerged on the internet, and Republicans too. Nip it in the bud, understand what's happening. This I think they called out Nick Fuentes here, but he had a pretty good statement filing Charlie Kirk's murder, and I'm curious to see what will happen from that. Will he start walking back some of his comments as well. But I kind of got the sense where, this kind of affected him personally because he, a gunman showed up to his house, and wanted to hurt him. So I think he might see where this is going. And I got the sense he was looking to tone down some of the rhetoric as well. And I get the sense there's a desire to unify on folks in conservative circles. And so maybe we'll see, some people acknowledging certain language isn't acceptable, but you can't keep calling folks far right. You can't keep using dehumanizing language, because I think that's the source of a lot of this, because it normalizes it and accepts it, and it further feeds into this idea of societal collapse. But I think you have to stigmatize and socially isolate these people, and it might be painful to do, to be totally honest. I don't know that there's a right way to do it. My first inclination would be, well, monitor what people are saying online, but obviously that is a slippery slope, right? That could lead to a deterioration of freedom for everyone. So I don't know if that's the right answer. But you need to give young people hope for the future, but you also need to hold language accountable. So the adults in the room, folks who've been around for a while, need to step up to the plate and stop providing fuel that fans the flames of all of this, and start providing hope for the future and hope through leadership. I think that solves the problem, because you can't punish these kids because, and these young adults, right? Because they have nothing to lose. So there's, if you believe in nihilistic fatalism, there's nothing for you to lose. And so I think that's where we're at. I think we need more leadership on, both the traditional sides of the aisle. And I think we need people need to communicate. Maybe real life, I don't even know, but because like, how do you extend an olive branch to Blackpill subculture on Reddit, right? Um, but I think, personal personal encounters, personal interactions. Like, it's clear both, Tyler Robinson and his partner had gone through a radical change. Like, they are different today than they were a couple years ago. And so how did the families, what role were the families in that? Like, how do you take conservative religious guys and then it turns into this? I think that's the question that needs to be asked. And what can average people do to get people out of the dark corners of the web? And I think that's, return to reality, a hope for the future, personal connections. If you have, if you think the world is going to end, you think everything's going to hell in a handbasket, there's no point of living, and you don't have a community, a real community, an in-person human community to interact with, I think that's going to push you further down the rabbit hole. So I think, return to community is really important too, to help people who are in this state. And because I do think it's a mental state as much as a political one, but help these people get out of this, so you can, further isolate it. I don't think it's gonna be easy though. I don't think it's gonna be easy at all. But I think it's important that we understand what is happening here, and that this isn't just a left-right divide anymore. We're past that. We're into something new, like, the early fascists of the 19 and 1920s. We don't necessarily have a language for it. I'm using nihilistic fatalism to describe this. You might use something different, but I think this is where we're at, and I think we need to start having conversations around this, rather than continuing to blame each other for the political situation we're in right now, because I don't think that is going to solve anything anytime soon. So that's what I got for you today. If you found this useful, thoughtful, I'd love it if you'd like and subscribe. Appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next video.